Hey everybody, it's Tyler the Fro, and this time we've got our first in a long series of Nationals testing decks. I definitely wanted to try something that was going to survive the new BT10 metagame, and what better option to start with than good old-fashioned Machinedramon. I think it's finally going to get its time in the sun. It's getting a whole new batch of goodies, including level 5 cyborgs, a whole new Machinedramon, and a tamer that's custom built for this thing. Well, I've got a couple months before the actual Nationals event. I wanted to give the deck a shot just to see if I could establish some play patterns, get some testing in with that. When the new cards get implemented, I'm already going to have a leg up, so I want to get that out of the way nice and early. But the big thing with Machinedramon in BT11 is it changes from simply playing Machinedramon to a kind of deck that wants to build up a stack. Chaosdramon has already kind of switched the deck over into that kind of play style, but the new Machinedramon really benefits from that. So I've decided to run more level 4s that I can start Digivolving chains onto. I've made it so that my level 5s are more consistent, and they're much more reflective of the kinds of level 5s that I'm going to be playing in the upcoming format. So without further ado, let's break down the deck, starting with our level 2s. We've got our 4 copies of Pagumon. Kind of hard to argue against this thing. It's kind of like the default. Going forward, I might go with the Doraemon, just because that really benefits from tucking new sources underneath it. But for the time being, I'm finding that the Pagumon is a little bit more powerful. At our level 3s, I'm only running 8, but there's a big reason for that, and we'll see that in our level 4s. So we've got 4 copies of Haguramon and 4 copies of Chikurimon. Haguramon at 4 copies, you pretty much have to if you're running any kind of machine or cyborg deck. It's kind of a default. It's like trying to run Jessmon without Huckmon. Like, it's, you play Machinedramon, you're playing 4 of these. It's obvious. These ones are a little bit more metagame specific. They could very well be Chumons. They could be the other Chikurimon that triggers in security. I'm finding right now that the Digicross decks like Blue Flare or even the new Dorbrickmon deck, those are a little bit harder to keep under control, so reducing play cost is a little bit more powerful. Plus, most importantly, this thing shuts down Death-Xmon. De-Digivolving my Machinedramon is one of the biggest ways of interacting with it, so if I can shut that off early by playing a level 3, I'm going to do that. Getting into our level 4s, we've got our good old-fashioned staple 4 copies of Guardramon. Can't play Machinedramon without those. Next up, we've got 2 Mechanorimon, and the spice factor here, 4 copies of Numamon. The Guardramon, pretty much a staple for any Machinedramon deck. It's a big blocker, and its inheritable is very relevant. It basically lets you trash a machine or cyborg from your hand on attacking, and you get to draw 2. Pretty much a necessity for setting up your trash and digging into your level 6s. And on top of that, 2 costs to Digivolve is pretty cheap. The Mechanorimon, it's a machine, so it's relevant. There are some decks that just can't swing through this guy. It can't attack, but it's basically just a massive brick wall for any kind of aggressive deck, because anytime it deletes a Digimon in combat, you get to unsuspend it. So if they're coming at you with, say, a whole mess of V-Mons or trying to Rookie Rush you down, you just slam this thing down for 4 memory and block, and just wipe their board. Also, because it's only 4 memory, 1 more than its Digivolution cost, actually, usually you're going to be hard playing this thing. So it's another very good building block to getting directly into a level 5 on the following turn. But there's no better Digimon at doing that right now than Numamon. At only 3 memory, it's the same cost as playing any of these rookies. At 1 cost for Digivolving, I can Digivolve onto, say, a Haguramon for 1, draw that card for basically nothing. Numamon has had a bit of a contentious past with Machinedramon, but in this kind of deck, I feel like if we're going to be accelerating up into a level 6, this is a very welcome building block. This also builds really well into, say, a memory setter, because I can play a Numamon and then Digivolve a level 5 onto it immediately. Whereas if it's something a little bit bigger, like say Mechanorimon, more often than not, I would just be passing the turn with my opponent at 1 memory, and if they've got a memory setter, it's basically worthless. So I'd much rather have the option of going Numemon into a level 5. And speaking of level 5s, here's the bread and butter of any Machinedramon deck. This is where all of the discourse comes from, what kind of ratios you're going to be running. There are a couple of new tools that are coming out in BT11, like Metal Tyrannomon, Gigadramon. So right now we just have to make do with what we've got. I've got 2 copies of Metal Mamemon, 2 Andromon for the blocker, 3 copies of Metal Tyrannomon, 2 copies of Metal Greymon, 1 Megadramon for security attack, 2 copies of Metal Greymon with the piercing. Then we've got Metal Greymon, Cyberdramon, another Megadramon, and finally 1 copy of Volcanomon. With this package right here, these are the things you want to be digivolving on top of your Numemon, because they mill you 3 cards digging for a Machinedramon or a Chaosdramon. These are kind of your most important things. The combination of reboot plus blocker is huge, because it lets you still be aggressive while also being defensive at the same time. I'm liking the 2 copies of Metal Mamemon right now, because you can set up stacks where you can de-digivolve an opposing Digimon with Chaosdramon, and then get it down to a play cost of 5, like say a level 3 or level 4. You swing in, and then you will trigger your Inheritable to blow up their board, basically. It's worth noting that in BT11, the new Gigadramon gives reboot, so this Metal Tyrannomon will most likely be cut down to 2 copies, and then running 1 to 2 copies of the Gigadramon. Still going to be playing with those ratios, but I want at least 3 copies of the Metal Tyrannomon, so I at least see them frequently. Because we're going tall rather than wide most of the time, I've got 2 options for security attack to kind of accelerate our clock. Volcanomon and Megadramon are both kind of staples for accelerating how quickly you're able to win the game. Volcanomon, just by being a 9k blocker, is also just huge. So in a pinch, I can digivolve a Numemon into a Volcanomon and stall out a couple turns. Megadramon, his on play is delete up to 2 of my opponent's Digimon with 3000 DP or less. It doesn't come up too frequently, but if you're trying to blow up, say, a couple Chumon, if you're trying to blow up a Gazamon, or if you're playing against Bloomlord and they've got like red Vegiemons and trying to build off of that, you can just like slam that down and gotcha. I feel like having 3 blocker effects is kind of the gold standard for Machinedramon. You always want to see at least 1, and this way it gives you a little bit of extra diversity in terms of building up your stack, because the last thing you need is to go like 3 copies of Andromon and then you end up drawing like all 3 and you can only gain like 1 memory back with Machinedramon. Next up we have a 1-2 punch of Metal Greymons. These are kind of your best interaction for opposing like go tall decks, because Metal Greymon on Digivolve can de-digivolve 1 and then delete something with 3k or less. It doesn't happen too frequently where you're going to be like just going straight up into a Metal Greymon, but when you do, it's more than welcome. Its big thing in the deck is the Inheritable, which lets you punch an unsuspended Digimon. When you combine it with the EX01 Metal Greymon that has piercing, you're able to still get checks by getting rid of any opposing Digimon on the field. You just swing into it, take it out, still check. Sometimes if you want to be more aggressive, you're stacking your security attack +1, and then if you have a reboot, you get to unsuspend and protect your own Chaosdramon or your Machinedramon. Lastly, we've got a little bit of a buff. We've got Metal Greymon, which gives 3k DP on your turn, and Cyberdramon, which gives +2k DP on each turn as long as you have a suspended Tamer. I'm running a couple more Tamers than you usually see, just because I want to consistently have this active, because it's a very good defensive tool. Having a 14k Chaosdramon on my opponent's turn with blocker is very difficult to swing through, so I like having this here for that purpose. The Metal Greymon, As a one-of, it's fine. I like having this at like the top of my stack if I'm going to use it, especially if my opponent's playing a bunch of Digivolve effects, because that way we'll have a Metal Greymon with an automatic security attack +2, plus all these effects that are underneath it. So if my opponent goes into a Death X, I'm still posing a very serious threat. Lastly, for Digimon, we've got the namesake of the deck. We've got 4 copies of Machinedramon and 4 copies of the EX03 Chaosdramon. This is probably one of the best reasons to play this deck right now, because Digivolve 3 is a huge game right now against, say, Metal Garurumon X or like Bloomlord. You basically want your opponent to build up their stack first, then you can accelerate directly into a Chaosdramon, ruin all their plans, and then just counterpunch with your inheritable effects. This Machinedramon is pretty much the best Machinedramon that we have access to right now. We're going to get a new one in BT11 that is a very powerful combo piece with this Machinedramon. But in the meantime, it's still a very potent attacker on its own. It's usually a very memory efficient level 6 to just hard play, because you gain 1 memory back for each source that you tuck underneath it. So if you build a 5 stack, you're playing a level 6 for 7 memory. If you have a memory setter in play, your opponent goes to 4, but you still have this massive Machinedramon. Defensively, Machinedramon and Chaosdramon are very potent right now, because they have their own built-in protections that keep them around. By trashing 2 Digivolution sources that are level 5 cyborgs, we can keep the Machinedramon in play against just hard deletion effects, and the Chaosdramon will prevent itself from being returned to the hand or deck, as well as being deleted. Pretty much your only way of getting rid of these things is either Digivolution or Chaos Degradation. So Mastamon can be a little tricky, but frankly, as long as I face decks that are more like towards your Metal Garurumon, your War Greymons, even your Black War Greymons, I feel like it's a little bit more favored in those kinds of matchups. So pretty much as long as we dodge Chaos Degradation, then we've got a very, very difficult and resilient threat. I feel like just hard playing the Machinedramon is plan A, just because if we have to trash 2 sources to keep it in play, we can get those sources right back by digivolving the Chaosdramon on top of the Machinedramon, because you just tuck 3 sources back underneath it. It gets bigger, it gets more powerful, and your opponent's basically wasted their turn trying to get rid of this thing. Notably, I'm not running any Death X, largely because I've had a couple shells of this with Death Xmon, and I found that players right now, especially in the English metagame, are very well adjusted to playing around Death X. Digivolve 1 doesn't really do a whole lot against a Metal Garurumon deck, because you Digivolve 1 card, then they just Digivolve like 3 more times for all of your effort. A lot of decks right now are going tall rather than wide, so Death X is on average like 12 memory, and that's still a lot of memory to pass even in a deck like this. So I was finding that it was dead in my hand more often than not. Like, sure, I could Digivolve for 6 memory on top of one of my level 6s because they're both black, but then I run into issues where I lose the built-in protections that both of my level 6s have, so they would still be able to just delete the Death X, and I can't really do anything about that. So it's a big reason why I've got all of these like piercing effects, because a lot of the time I'm going to be attacking my opponent's Digimon and still getting checks, and that's more or less going to be how I control the board and how I interact. So it's a little bit more consistent than hoping and praying that Death X gets me there. Going into our Tamers, we've got 2 copies of Kazushioda, and then my little spice here is 3 copies of Kiyashiro. Kazu is kind of a staple for any machine or cyborg deck, because at the beginning of your turn, if you have one in play, you gain a memory, and then when you attack with a cyborg or machine, you can suspend this to draw a card and discard a card. So this is a very easy way of turning on the Cyberdramon inheritable. but I was finding that at 3 copies, I'm running a lot of Digimon that aren't actually Machine and Cyborg at the low end. Like, I would have turns where Kazu would be in play, but I've only got like Chikurimons and Numemons, so I wasn't actually gaining any memory. I wasn't actually being able to trigger his on attacking, so I found that cutting him down to 2 copies was kind of the way to go. Conversely, Kiyashiro at 3 copies has been very good for me. It's a memory setter. The color isn't really relevant because I'm not really running any blue options like Kaiser Nail, but when I attack with a level 5 or higher Digimon, if I have 7 or fewer cards in my hand, I can suspend him to draw a card. Machinedramon decks typically have very little in the ways of like raw card draw. It's a lot of like draw, discard, draw, discard, draw, discard, filtering effects like Ultimate Connection and Hagurumonn. So this way you can actually just build up a mass amount of cards in your hand. That's kind of the important thing here. Plus, if you have multiples of these in play, you get into a situation where you can put a ton of sources from your hand under a Machinedramon, swing in, suspend all 3 of these guys, and you just draw basically a new hand at that point. So Kiyashiro has been kind of a godsend in this regard. Lastly, in terms of options, we've got just 3 copies of Attack of the Heavy Mobile Digimon. This is kind of a surprise gotcha card, because by trashing a Machine or Cyborg from my hand, I can give any of my level 6s Rush and Blitz when I play them. Since both of my level 6s will tuck sources underneath them, it'll both trigger Attack of the Heavy Mobile Digimon and get the Rush and Blitz. And most importantly, it's a very good way of closing out a game. It's usually best as a finishing card, but it is a very efficient finisher for what it does, because even just out of nowhere, your opponent built up a stack expecting like, oh, I wiped your board, you can't really do anything, I've killed off your stack. You slam down Attack of the Heavy Mobile Digimon, you put a Metal Greymon underneath it, and you just punch their stack down, and suddenly tempo's back in your favor. Occasionally it'll trigger Insecurity. It's one of the few removal options I've got access to. I've been considering putting 2 copies of Ultimate Flare in there. Honestly, it's not a bad idea depending on the metagame. Right now, my meta hasn't exactly required me to use it, just because a lot of the on-play costs for Digimon are getting a little bit higher, so the sweeping effect isn't as relevant, but the D-Digivolve 3 is. Conversely, Hyper Infinity Cannon, I might start trying to play some of those as well, because you still get your D-Digivolve 3 on one guy, and if you've already got a Chaosdramon or Machinedramon in play, you can tuck another source underneath, make them bigger, and then delete something with 6k or less. So that's definitely something I'm going to be testing out in the future, depending on how relevant it may be. So far for the EX03 metagame, it hasn't been super relevant. If I was going to run the Hyper Infinity Cannons, I would probably switch the Kiyashiros into Heroes just for the DP boost, but to more consistently have access to Red, so I can actually just play the Hyper Infinity Cannon. But for now, Attack of the Heavy Mobile Digimon has been kind of the sweet spot at 3. 4, I was finding I was drawing more of these than actually the Digimon I need to pitch to play it. And at 2 copies, I wasn't seeing it frequently enough, so at 3, it's kind of exactly where I need it to be. So overall, it's a very good baseline for where I want to be for testing the play lines here. Because ideally, I want to be setting up Digivolution chains where I go, say, Numemon for 3 off of the Kiyashiro, go up to 0, then set my opponent to 3, Digivolve into a Metal Mamemon or what have you, flip over 3 cards, try to dig for those level 6s. If I find one, awesome. If I don't, I've set up my trash, I've dug down 3 more cards. More importantly, this also makes it a little bit easier to play around opposing memory setters, because this sequence gets my opponent to exactly 3 memory where it's going to be anyway. I'm not giving them anything extra. As well, this is also a very good tool for the first turn, because we can Digivolve a Chikurimon in back, then for 1 memory, choke my opponent to 1, just Digivolve into a Numemon, and then they got to pass to me, give me plenty more memory, and then I can start setting up those chains again. So overall, I have a feeling this is probably going to be where I'm going to be going with for Nationals, just because it gets much more tools to work with for that actual format than, say, the Beelstermon deck that I won my Sword Championship with. Just because that deck doesn't really get anything new, and I'm expecting a lot of Metal Garurumon X and Black War Greymon X especially, and that Black War Greymon X has access to Greymon X antibody, which makes any removal based strategy like Beelstermon very difficult to work with. So I'd much rather sidestep that problem entirely by going into a different archetype, especially one that can hold its own against Metal Garurumon as is. Generally speaking, I've got a very good matchup against the X antibody decks because they build up into one guy. I de-digivolve that guy and punch it. It's a very tempo-oriented deck, and it's very easy to steal tempo away from my opponents with this kind of strategy. So I'm probably going to end up having a couple more testing blogs down the line in the Road to Nationals, because I want to be documenting like every step of the way how this deck evolves and changes over the course of the next couple months. So there's about to be a lot of content for you guys in that regard. Don't forget to like, subscribe, punch that bell, do all that YouTube stuff, and have yourselves a great day.